Okay, so we're going to make a start. We have an unprecedented number of people registered for this event, which we are so grateful for. So welcome to the many people who are joining us here online from around the world for this webinar, as I said, on women, slavery and the Anglican Church. So I am Dr. Leona Vaughan. I am the Derby Fellow here at the University of Liverpool for slavery and unfree labour research. And specifically, my work is on developing anti-colonial research methodologies for this subject area. So this webinar is the second in the series of online panel discussions about the Anglican Church and slavery. And these are being held in advance of the flagship international convening planned by the Church of England's Racial Justice Unit to be held in summer 2025. And that event will explore the historical involvement of the Anglican Church in the institution of slavery, the lasting implications of slavery and colonialism on the church, and the actions that they are taking to progress racial justice. So the church's truth-telling convening will be held here in Liverpool, a city itself steeped in the history of transatlantic slavery and the enslavement of Africans, and home to the world's first international slavery museum. So I created this webinar series centralising the voices and stories of the enslaved and their descendants internationally as a collaboration to contextualise the recent and ongoing work that the Church of England have been doing to reckon with and repair the legacies of their involvement in the traffic and enslavement of Africans. My starting point was really, how can people understand the desire for healing and repair when actually they don't know about the damage and the harm that has been done? So the opening webinar in this series explored the relationship between the church and slavery in terms of involvement, financial benefit, and impact on religious teachings. And this webinar will consider specifically the role of women as enslavers and beneficiaries of African enslavement and their links to the Anglican Church, as resistors and rebels against slavery, including their involvement as church leaders, and consider how, as a result of slavery and colonialism, women, and especially Black women, are viewed in the church today. So the series is produced, hosted and promoted by the University of Liverpool Centre for the Study of International Slavery, CSIS, and these panels are intended to make research and knowledge on this topic, especially from across the diaspora of affected communities, accessible and open to all. So we are recording the webinar for the CSIS website and YouTube pages, and both links will be shared with participants in the chat alongside the recommendations for further reading and information shared by our experts today. So another important note for our participants: I know that you will have burning questions. I'm really excited about this webinar, but please do submit your questions for the panelists via the Q&A during the discussion, because we can't take any more questions once the Q&A has begun. And while we will record the entire webinar, only the panel discussion will be featured in the public recording, not the Q&A from participants. So now over to the main event. It is apt that the experts leading this discussion on women's slavery and the Anglican Church are true powerhouse diasporic thinkers, activists, researchers and creatives. And they are all women, and that is intentional. Our moderator, Michelle Charters, is the head of the International Slavery Museum, which is located here in Liverpool, UK. And she is the first Black woman to hold that position. She is also the incoming co-director of the CSIS at the University of Liverpool. Michelle is a community activist who previously worked for 17 years as the Chief Executive Officer of the Cumber Amani Millennium Centre in Toxteth, Liverpool. She was the founding chair of the Merseyside Black History Month group and trustee on the board of National Museums Liverpool for the past 5 years. Throughout her career, she has been and continues to be committed to uncovering and promoting the truth of Black experiences in a collective fight for justice. So, no better person to really take the lead with this conversation. Michelle is joined by a stellar, absolutely stellar lineup of experts on this topic, and I really can barely contain my excitement for this discussion. So Michelle, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Leona, and thank you very much for the nice, kind introduction. I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who has come onto the Zoom to listen to this amazing event, and thank you for inviting me to moderate. I'm going to start tonight with speaking to or introducing you to Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers. Stephanie Jones-Rogers is an Associate Professor of History at UC Berkeley and Director of the African and African American History Writers Workshop. Her research focuses on gender and the American slavery, extending to the 19th century legal and economic history. Her first book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, was the recipient of multiple awards, including the Lapidus Center for the Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery 2020, Harriet Tubman Prize. Her current project, Women of the Trade, reshapes our understanding of the British Atlantic slave trade by centering the fundamental experiences of women, free and captive. I would like to now pass the time on to Stephanie. Stephanie, welcome very much to this webinar.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to thank Dr. Mary Booth and Dr. Leona Vaughn for inviting me to be a part of this really extraordinary and important webinar, and as part of this phenomenal work that you're all doing. And thank you all for being here. I'm here in California, so it's very early in the morning, but I wish you a wonderful evening. I'm thanking you for sharing your evening with me. So in the summer of 1793, over the course of a 9-week and 4-day voyage from West Africa to Jamaica, Anna Maria Falconbridge, the wife of the famed slave ship surgeon turned abolitionist Alexander Falconbridge, sailed aboard a slave ship, the Alexander, with Captain Shaw commanding. While on her way to the British Caribbean, she penned a letter to a friend back home in England, wherein she remarked upon a pleasant journey that contrasted markedly with the Middle Passage voyages abolitionist slave ship captains, officers, and crews described. While many African captives suffered from seasickness early in the voyage, they soon recovered in large part because of the captain's utmost kindness and care, according to Anna. Filled with only 2/3 of its full complement, that is, the total number of African captives that were slated to be sold in the British Caribbean, captives had plenty of room to move about the hold and were, quote unquote, full as well habited as they would have been in Africa. Contrary to abolitionists' assertions about slave ship captains forcing African captives to remain tightly packed in their vessels holds for days on end, Anna Maria observed Captain Shaw's policy of allowing captives to stay the entire day on deck when the weather would permit, if they liked. They were fed an abundance of excellent foods, a fusion of English and African fare. They were cared for, even doted upon when unwell, although very few found themselves in this unfortunate condition. Upon reaching Jamaica, all but one disembarked alive, in much higher health than when they had embarked, according to Anna. So here, Anna Maria Falconbridge offers an astounding account of a maritime world of enslavement turned upside down. She contradicted hundreds of accounts of what took place aboard the average English slave ship during the Middle Passage. In Falconbridge's telling, there was no violence, no atrocity, no despair, no tears, no mourning. To be sure, she admitted that this ship upon which she traveled may have been exceptional and the circumstances on board unique, but she dismissed this likelihood as easily as she proposed it. The relatively uneventful Middle Passage of the captives she accompanied stood in stark contrast to the accounts of sailors, surgeons, and even Navy officers who witnessed the gore of the trade. She called liars the men who unshackled dead slaves from living ones, who mocked mixtures of blood and excrement from ship hold floors. She declared untruthful. Oh, good grief. She declared untruthful those who witnessed captains and crewmen tossing babies overboard because they cried too much or they weren't worth their freight. The men, like her husband, who suspected that some captives died of no other cause but despair. Anna Maria Falconbridge dismissed all these tales of woe in favor of her own, and in the end, while she brushed aside assumptions that she supported the slave trade, she declared emphatically that she saw nothing aberrant about it. Africans were physically and materially better off enslaved in the colonies than they were living as free people in Africa, and slavery was not morally or religiously wrong in her opinion. In fact, under the specific circumstances within which the British carried on the trade, it was right. According to Falconbridge, the British carried no blame for African captivity because a small West African minority of godless despots and tyrants robbed the majority of their people of their lives, enslaved them, and sold them. This led to immense unhappiness in Africa, she argued, and within this context, according to Anna Maria, the British slave trade promoted happiness on the continent. Moreover, the British saved African captives from eternal damnation by acting as civilized Christian masters to them. She wished freedom to every creature formed by God who knows its value, but that didn't include Africans, who she wrongly assumed had not tasted its sweets. In spite of outward appearances, Anna Maria Falconbridge believed Africans never experienced freedom, and as long as they maintained superstitions, as long as they remained superstitious and ignorant of Christ, she strongly supported the continuation of the slave trade. In spite of witnessing some of the darkest dimensions of the slave trade firsthand and never owning enslaved people, Anna Maria Falconbridge believed slavery befitted African men, women, and children. And women who did own them offered nearly identical justifications for why they supported racially based slavery and their decisions to own human beings. When American slave-owning women wrote about enslaved people and the system of bondage they helped create and sustain, they too sanitized the institution and erased the brutality, privation, agony, loss, tears, sweat, and blood that made the institution of slavery what it was. They portrayed themselves and their female ancestors as forever sacrificing women who played purely benevolent roles within the system. To hear them tell it, enslaved people didn't suffer under the weight of their female owners' domination. They only benefit from slave-owning women's sacrifices and acts of benevolence. Many of these professedly Christian slave-owning women contended that a strong tie existed between them and the people they enslaved. This tie was bound together by moral obligation. God ordained their European ancestors to buy, rule over, Christianize, and civilize people of African descent, and they were duty-bound to follow suit. One of these slave-owning women, Letitia Burwell, believed that African-descended people should be grateful for their enslavement and might even show their appreciation by creating a holiday to celebrate their abduction, forcible removal from families and communities, coerced settlement across the Atlantic, and the endless toil that followed. While Burwell and others contended that white Christian domination and enslavement at the hands of Europeans was beneficial to African people of African descent, it was a heavy burden for her and white Southerners like her. In her opinion, this was especially true for white American women, whose conduct she believed towards these barbaric people was especially commendable. For avowedly Christian women like Anna Maria Falconbridge and Letitia Burwell, the enslavement of African-descended people was not incompatible with the tenets of their religion. At the core of their beliefs lie the idea that Africans were non-believers, and as such, it was every white Christian's duty to instruct them in God's word and to teach them how to live righteous lives. The system of slavery created an ideal context within which they believed they could do this work. However, these professedly Christian slave-owning women turned a blind eye to their male kin and employers' sexual violation of enslaved women and girls. They orchestrated the routine separation of enslaved families through purchase and sale in the slave market, and they perpetrated acts of brutality against even the most vulnerable members of enslaved communities. And when questioned about the justness of these acts, Christian slave-owning women either cast blame on enslaved people for what they had done to them, or they rooted their reasoning for enabling or engaging in these abhorrent acts in Christianity. This was acceptable in American slaveholding society because being a good Christian meant keeping your subordinates, be they wives, children, or slaves, in submission. This was what abolitionists and enslaved people called slaveholding religion. It was a version of Christianity that demanded obedience from enslaved people at all times. It was one that compelled missionaries and theologians to revise the Bible so that all references to revolution or liberation were excised and pro-slavery passages were foregrounded. It was a Christianity that led Christian slave-owning women to violently chastise enslaved people who sought out the Lord's word, who wanted to know Christ. As a group of parishioners at a Charleston, Virginia church listened to a visitor's declarations about the wrongs of slavery and the sins of slaveholding, one woman emphatically responded, "I am a slaveholder and I glory in it." She and other women throughout the South, the American South, seized upon the privileges that slave ownership afforded to them, and they didn't believe their religiosity should impede or curtail their right to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any questions, Chinny? Do you have any questions to Stephanie?
Sorry, I'm just trying to find my video. Oh gosh, I found that so fascinating because it's a story that we hardly ever hear. It's a story that we don't really recognize. We hear a lot about white Christians' role in the abolition of slavery, but we don't often hear what role that white women had. And I guess I was thinking about some of the ways in which we see these ideas perpetuated today when we look at, for example, the differences between Black feminism and white feminism, or some of the ways in which white womanhood might continue to have some of these vestiges of these ideas, because I'm going to be talking a little bit later on about what's the impact today, and I think in terms of our the descendants of enslaved people, but you know, some of those ideas still are perpetuated in the white population as well. Any thoughts about the kind of how it feels today?
Yeah.
Well, I can talk specifically about the American context, and maybe I won't steal your thunder in terms of the UK context. But I find that, you know, in the elections, for example, what you see manifest in our contemporary elections, white women in particular, their embrace of very problematic candidates for various political offices can in many respects be traced or connected to their embrace and their deep investments in white supremacy. And those deep investments in white supremacy can really be grounded in this historical moment that I described. They're very invested in the institution of slavery because it is one that privileges them as white people. Yes, they have all of these, disabilities, legal disabilities as women, but as white women, they have a particular kind of, it's a realm of freedom that they can access that other women are not able to access. So I think one of the ways to connect those two deep investments in white supremacy is to see the relationship between the historical moment and, say, for example, white women's political activism and their investments in candidates that stand for white supremacy.
Yeah. Sorry. Go on, Chin. So I think one of the things is that, this is the importance of us all doing the work that we do. And I think the main thing is that we continue to uncover. And sadly for us, that's the case. We have to uncover our history. We have to uncover our journey. But I think it's really important that things like CSIS and what Leona and the team have done in bringing people together, and especially women, to have these conversations is integral to the way in which we move forward, especially as a voice and especially as Black voices. So, thank you so much for sharing that, your work and what you found. So what I'm going to do is, our second guest has not been able to join us yet. So Chinny, I'm really sorry. I'm going to bring you in earlier than you expected. I hope you're ready. And what I'll do is introduce you. So to all the listeners and viewers, Chinny MacDonald is our next speaker. She is the author of God is Not a White Man and Other Revelations, which was shortlisted for the 2023 Michael Ramsey Prize. She speaks and writes often on issues of race, gender, and faith, including a range of national media, as well as contributes regularly to BBC religion and ethics programmes. Her first book, Am I Beautiful?, explored body image amongst Christian women. Chinny is the director of the Westminster-based Religion and Society think tank, FIOS. She is also a trustee of Christian Aid and the vice chair of the Greenbelt Festival. Chinny, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here, and I'm really honoured that you'd asked me to speak. I am going to talk about the legacy of slavery and look a little bit about the impacts of what it is to be Black and a woman, and that intersection of race and Christianity and its impact on Black women today. Now, it is obvious to say that the transatlantic slave trade was one of the most terrible injustices in human history. It involved the dehumanization of whole people groups. It involved violence and oppression and brutality for hundreds of years. Yes, the transatlantic slave trade ended, but that will take a long time to get over, both in the minds of the descendants of those slaves, as well as all Black people who have to live with the idea that such a thing could happen to people who look like them, to people who look like our families, but also in the minds of the white people who perpetrated this crime against humanity. Now, Christianity, and in particular Anglicanism, has been seen as the white man's religion. We heard a bit of it just now. And I think about my own family heritage. I'm Nigerian. My great-grandfather was ordained in southeast Nigeria in 1940, ordained into the Anglican Church. And we've got a long line of priests and vicars within my heritage. And I used to hear about these stories about my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother and the fact that they ran a school for Christian wives. And I heard about all of these stories for many years until I realized that what my great-grandfather and great-grandmother were doing was inviting people, women who are about to get married, to come and stay with them and learn what it meant to be a good Christian wife. But what they were really teaching them was how to bake cakes, how to dress properly, how to drink tea, how to use china, all of these things that are associated with not just Anglicanism, but what it was to be British, what it was to be English. So from the very earliest formation of my own faith, Christianity was intertwined with this idea of Englishness, and that to be someone who was from Africa or of African descent was to be lesser in some way, was to be less close to godliness. And I sometimes think about what ways does the Christian missionary movement, throughout history, but continues today in terms of the international development, perpetuate this idea of the slave-holding religion. There was still this idea that Black people, and in particular Black women, were less than. We've all heard the Malcolm X quote that the Black woman is the mule of the world. Art tells us a lot about what a society believes. The art that is contained within the most beautiful images and throughout art history in the galleries that you see throughout Europe, these tell us something about what it is to be Black and a woman and what is thought about us. We see it in the many images of white God and white Jesus, some of the most famous artworks that we see: Holman Hunt's Light of the World, Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross, The Head of Christ by Warner Salmon, which is the 1940 image, which has become the most reproduced image of all time, which represents Jesus as a all-American, blue-eyed, long-haired, basically a frat boy. Christina Cleveland describes the ideas about who is right and what is good and true and beautiful and powerful with the term white male God, one word, and his minions. Just as enslaved people were told that they were less than, and the slave Bible they were given took out those pages and those passages that might have given them hope about their liberation and their worth and their value, this idea is still around and it's still in the atmosphere today. So in the short time together, I want to talk about 4 Black women and share a little bit about their relationship to slavery, racism, misogyny, and the church. And I'm going to share them all now, so I don't have to keep sharing my screen. Their images are here. Hopefully you can see that. They are Eve Pitts to the top left. I'll talk about her in a second. Beyonce, Adoha from the sitcom Rev, and Sojourner Truth. So keep these images in your mind as I speak. So first I will talk about Eve Pitts. Eve Pitts, Reverend Eve Pitts, is the first of 4 Black women I'm going to talk about. And she was the first to be ordained in the Church of England. She was born in Jamaica. She was ordained 30 years ago in 1994. And she's now one of several Black female priests in the Church of England. You might say that got it all sorted. Globally, an Anglican is more likely to look like me or Eve Pitts than the Archbishop of Canterbury. You find Anglicanism represented in places like Nigeria or in West Africa or in all of these places where there are brown people who look like us. All over the country, all over the world, Black women, many who can look into their family trees and see enslaved women that had come before them, are living and serving in the Church of England and the Anglican Communion. Now, this is a good thing, but it is not easy to rid the Church of the pervasive, racist and sexist messages that the Church has contributed to for many centuries. In an interview with The Guardian, Eve Pitts said, as a Black woman knowing something about the history of our people, she struggled to reconcile how faith has been used to control our minds. From a very early age, she believed Christianity had been used to put Black people into new chains. On plantations, for instance, reading was strictly prohibited, and a brand of Christianity rooted in white supremacy was the only education that enslaved people received. Even today, says Eve Pitts, this legacy means that she herself refuses to touch on ideas of hell and damnation in her sermons because she says, Black people are terrified enough. Black women like Rev Pitts can feel out of place. Black bodies, Black women's bodies existing in a space that highlights and elevates maleness and whiteness as superior takes its toll on women, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. We know that enslaved people experienced all manner of horrific abuses. We know that for Black women, they were the victims of sexual violence, as we heard, sanctioned often by slave owners who would rape their slaves on Saturday and then go to church on Sunday. According to some sources, 58% of all enslaved women between the ages of 15 and 30 were sexually assaulted by their slave owners and other white men. As if the routine sexual assault were not enough, Black women also endured lynching, FGM, forced sterilization, were made to take part in experimental reproductive surgeries, including C-sections without anesthesia, to improve medical treatment for women, which meant white women. Now, we cannot underestimate the entanglement of Christianity with slavery. I often think about a pamphlet by Charles Carroll, who in 1900 argued on the basis of scripture that Black people's destiny was to serve white people. He wrote a delightfully titled booklet called, Is the Negro a Beast or in the Image of God? The Liverpool Courier, I thought this would be pertinent today, told its readers in the year of the 1919 race riots here in the UK that whites regarded Blacks as, quote, part child, part animal, and part savage. And this was 1919. This was long after slavery had ended. Theology backed up and justified this treatment of Black women as well. Professor Robert Beckford, who I know has been involved in these seminars, is a theologian and director of the University of Winchester's Institute for Climate and Social Justice. And he said of the Church of England's engagement with its relationship to slavery in the Caribbean and beyond, was often to talk about how it abolished it. We hear a lot about William Wilberforce. He said this: "The focus on abolition is an obfuscation of the horror of the slave trade and a willingness to collude with the subhumanization of Black people. What it means ultimately is there is no recognition of how the Church's theological ideas made slavery possible." All of these impacts have continue to have an effect on us. There is generational trauma. All of this stuff can't easily be forgotten. Black people today are still suffering from misogynoir, from violence, from PTSD because of the racism that they experience today. It may be over, but in many ways, we are still in chains. So Black women are working out their own liberation. The second image I want to talk about, personally, these will be a bit quicker now, is a Doha from Rev. Rev is a BBC sitcom which tells the story of an inner city Church of England church. And there are Black women who are turning their backs on the church, but there are many who stay within the church. In churches around the world, it is women in general, and often Black women in particular, who work tirelessly behind the scenes, giving of themselves in service to God and their communities. What do we get for that commitment to the church? I'm fascinated by the different characterizations of Black women in culture and society. One of the caricatures of Black women is the idea of the Black church lady. And we see this in this woman, Adoha Onyeka, played by Ellen Thomas in the BBC sitcom. She perfectly encapsulates this idea of the sacrificial Black woman found in churches up and down Britain. Rev brilliantly depicts the life of Vicar Adam Smallbone as he tries to run this inner city church. Adoha is a loyal and faithful servant of the church. There is something in the way she is portrayed by scriptwriters that betrays the ways in which stereotypes about Black women are perpetuated in art and film and screen. When Rev first came out, the BBC press pack accompanying the show described the character of Adoha as overbearing, maternal, and yet unnervingly sensual. Adoha is what's known as a cassock chaser. She's the church matriarch with strong traditional views on what's appropriate in church and how it should be run. Adoha will do anything for Ada, the vicar, and that is what scares him. This idea of the Black woman, the Black church lady, as selfless, but also somehow over-sexualized, overpowering, and overbearing, is an idea that runs straight from the transatlantic slave trade. Both the strong Black woman archetype, strong physically strong, and the dehumanization, that Black women are the tails and not the heads, especially when they try to get ideas above their station. Eve Pitt said that in 1997 she delivered a sermon denouncing fellow clergy for ignoring and sidelining her. And as a result, she was asked to resign by the Bishop of Birmingham. It was, she says, a hellish experience of being treated as less than because she stood up for herself. When you are in an institution that is so powerful and you're experiencing racism, she said, it is very difficult to stand up alone and very lonely. The third woman is my hero, Beyonce. Now, many Black women are not just confined, that they're not finding a home in the Anglican Church. In the UK, census data shows that for the first time, less than half of the population is Christian. Many are describing themselves as non-religious. And young Black women are increasingly finding that they just cannot stand for a church in which white supremacy and patriarchy are what is demonstrated or symbolized in the pulpit. There's been a rise in especially millennial women turning back to African indigenous spiritualities, where they worship female deities from Santeria or Ifa from West Africa. They worship goddesses such as Oshun. I showed Beyonce because in Beyonce's Lemonade album, she plays with these ideas of female empowerment through indigenous African religions. And the final Black woman that I want to talk about is Sojourner Truth. Born in 1797 in Ulster County in New York, she would never know her birthday. She would never know where she was from. She had no last name. At one point during her family's enslavement, they were moved to a dismal basement where men, women, and children slept together on a floor of hay, covering wooden boards laid over a wet, uneven, muddy earth, an underground dungeon. Now, they were denied any basic comforts. Truth believed, because slave owners maintained their mastery through a warped imaginary in which the people they owned didn't or even desire such comforts. They were understood to be inhumanly strong and yet innately inferior. Now, Sojourner Truth's mother taught her children the Lord's Prayer and assured them that God would come to their aid if they asked him to. He would come to them when they were beaten or poorly treated or when they got into trouble. To be born a slave, thought Sojourner Truth, was to be born not fully alive. For her, such a birth entailed a living death sentence. So she remade herself. She rebirthed herself. For over 40 years, she was known as Isabella. But when she reached middle age, she decided to give herself a new name, Sojourner Truth. Jennifer Banks's book, Natality, says that if slavery as an institution involved remaking people, Sojourner Truth provides a rare example of a slave's testimony of her own remaking. She went on to spread a message of abolition of temperance and women's rights. Still, she rose, and she became one of the leading activists of the 19th century. As I'm sure lots of us will know, one of her most famous quotes from her speech, Ain't I a Woman?, where she says, "That little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men, because Christ wasn't a woman." Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him.
Thank you. So thank you so much for that, Chunni. Have you got any questions, Stephanie, for Chunni in relation to that? And then after that, I'm going to give some questions that have come from the audience.
So I was just fascinated by the portion of your discussion, your talk, which kind of connected this history of the Anglican Church and Christianity to your ancestors. And it just reminded me of, the fact that so many people think of Christianity as alien to the continent. And that's the furthest from the truth, because there are, these deep roots of Christianity on the continent. And so I just wondered if you might talk a little bit about perhaps particularly the role of women in Nigeria in relationship to, the church and the movement of the church there. If that's something that you could speak more deeply to.
Yeah, so this is one of the, I guess, contradictions and the inaccuracies and perceptions about Christianity. Some of the oldest churches in the world are found in Ethiopia. And Jesus was a brown man. Christianity is from the Middle East. So it is crazy, this idea that it has been interpreted as the white man's religion. There are all sorts of ways in which these ideas about whiteness and Europeanness still kind of penetrate and push through within African Anglicanism or the African church today. This idea that when one becomes a Christian or joins the church, that actually they will become more and more like the white man. But I would say that there are, just like there are many women, and particularly Black women, who are the backbone of churches in the UK today, it is women who are leading the charge within churches around the world, including in Nigeria. What you find is that it's normally the men who are the lead pastors, or the men who are kind of seen as the leaders. But when it comes to the kind of the movements, it's women who are making those things happen.
Okay. So in relation to that, I'm going to change up a little bit and now bring in Fiona. Sorry, I'm going to now bring in Fiona Compton, Fiona, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you. Fiona Compton is a St. Lucian artist, photographer, speaker, and historian who leads Know Your Caribbean, the world's top online platform for Caribbean history and culture, which reaches 3 million monthly visitors. She also hosts engaging workshops for young people and youth, for organisations and for corporations globally, focusing on community empowerment and representation. Fiona is going to give us a presentation on an insight into enslaved women and resistance in the Caribbean, and how relationships with African spirituality, herbal medicine, their resistance to Christian conversion brings to life the violent environment in which they both survived and died, touching on forced religious indoctrination and how enslaved women grappled with balancing physical survival and spiritual survival. Fiona, thank you. And I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. I need to first and foremost apologize for being so late, because on my Google Calendar, it says that I'm due to start now. So I was very confused and I logged in, wait, everyone's here, what's going on? So I think there was an issue with maybe the time difference on the Google Calendar. And I'm so sorry. And I'm actually really upset because I really wanted to hear everyone speaking. I'm a huge fan of everyone who's here. And I just want to extend my huge apologies first and foremost, because I was sitting here and I got the email from Mary and she's like, we're 40 minutes in, and I was like, let me tell you, like the blood rushed from my face. So I am so sorry.
No,
so I'm going to jump right in and share my screen. And if you could let me know if you guys can see it, and then I can you guys see it? Yes, okay. Yeah. Great. So I know I only have 10 minutes. I have to say it's going to be very difficult for me to condense all the things I want to say in 10 minutes. But first and foremost, the reason why you see the image on your right-hand side of, it says, this is an image that has been in my house for my whole life because my mother is a collector of Caribbean historical things. And this is an illustration from the 1800s in St. Lucia, which is where I'm from, where I am now. And as you can see, it has a gentleman, and it says underneath, the way we go to church in the country. And as you can see, he's barefoot, but he has his shoes in his hands. And that was, you know, and I had walked across that drawing my whole life, and then seeing that inscription changed everything for me in terms of looking at how the church has shaped our perceptions of ourselves, has shaped our identities so much, and especially, of course, the Anglican Church. So, of course, we know throughout history there has been attempts to remove African spirituality from a very long time. You can find this painting from the 15th century of missionaries burning down African spiritual churches on the continent. We also know that in terms of, in particular, the Church of England, in terms of their ownership of plantations, the investments into the South Sea Company, and also then during the compensation era when slavery was abolished and enslavers were paid, that there were 97 Anglican priests who claimed for compensation, which is as much as 46 million pounds in today's money. And even the Bishop of Exeter was a claimant for 3 plantations in Jamaica of 665 people, which is a massive amount. So, you know, that the church is inextricably intertwined into this. A lot of time people do think about the Catholic Church, but the Anglican Church in particular has been like instrumental in even shaping what slavery is today. So when we look at, for example, how the Church of England had created the Negro Bible, which had removed up to 80% of the original Bible and only left in certain passages that encourage subservience and obedience to your master and so on. All of these things were guided by the dealings of the Anglican Church. So even looking at how the slave codes right? So we're just going to go in the beginnings, and how this relates to women is going to come in shortly. But when we look at the different slave codes that were created, like the Code Noir, that was created for the French colonies, what we have to do is look at the first slave codes that were ever created, which were created in Barbados. And Barbados is important because when we look at, yes, now Barbados has become a republic in 2022, but Barbados is basically the only colony in the Caribbean to have been British from day dot. So when they landed in Barbados in the early 1600s and they started to develop enslavement, they created these codified laws which differentiated Negroes from Christians and created the whole concept of chattel enslavement. And this is really important. So when we look at, because this was the Act of Governing the Negroes, which started in the early, I think, 1630, and then it was revised and rechanged. And we can see, if we look at the top, the use of the violence against any Christians. So even the use of Christianity to segregate Christians from, quote unquote, from Negroes. So it's very important how Christianity has shaped the definitions of slavery through the use of their slave codes. It wasn't white first, it was Christian. Okay, so the definitions of race the separations of race. Initially, we look at the founding fathers of chattel enslavement. Christianity was in the forefront of these definitions and separations. Okay, and these things expanded into the plantation. So right now, what's going on in Barbados with the Drax Hall and everything that's going on with their quest for reparations, we look at, even for example, books and writings that were created on to give to enslavers, plantation owners, to instruct their Negroes on how to be better workers and to make your plantation be more efficient. So this book was written by Philip Gibbs on the assistance of one of the Drax family, the instruction for the treatment of Negroes. And within the instructions, they tell you what food to give them, how much, all of their rations, etc. But they also taught you hymns. And so we can see also some of the wordings of these things. The God great tends to his son, ripen all the fields of canes. 'Tis just as if he said, well done, good Negroes, I'll reward your pains. So even these were hymns that enslaved people on plantations were taught to sing. And as you can see, even the lines in the hymns directly correlate to subservience and a literal upgrowing of the sugarcane. So, the church has had massive influence in shaping slavery in the Caribbean. So moving on into countries like Jamaica. So currently, as it stands, Jamaica has the most churches per square kilometer in the world. And then looking at, when we can see this image here, which is from the late 1830s of a mass baptism that is happening in Jamaica. And you can see there's two columns. There's a column of men and a column of women who are being baptized. And some of the excerpts that I have included in here come from Matthew Lewis, who was an enslaver in Jamaica, who wrote his diaries around 1817, where he speaks about two things. So we can see on the top line here, we can see that it speaks about the concerns about building more churches, which could implement the concepts of freedom into the minds of enslaved people. And then in another excerpt, he speaks about the Negroes in Kingston who are basically flooding the churches, who spend all day there and never still out of church during the whole day, and who also get baptized, who flock to be baptized in great numbers, who have later come to get married and with great pomp and solemnity. All of these things looking at how Jamaica, which had the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the British West Indian history, was founded on the power of Obia. So when we look at Taki's rebellion that happened in the 1700s, it was formulated by the power and the strength of an Obia man. That was his advisor, that was his guide. And Obia was extremely instrumental in empowering the spirits and the minds of the enslaved people. Of course, afterwards, when Taki's rebellion was squashed, they put in these Obia laws that started in 1760 and now still remain across the Caribbean today in many different countries. So I'll get back to that in a moment. Let's talk a moment for the destruction of Black femininity, especially within the Caribbean. When we look at Renaissance paintings and images of beauty, which are based on European and especially Nordic beauty standards, Black women are the antithesis of this, right? In terms of looking at the pureness of women, in terms of the darker the skin, the less pure that you are, all of these things do come from influences that come in from the church. When we look at even just the concepts of angels, so, and in terms of beautiful angels and how they look, a Black person is never present in that. Going through my father passed away in 2007, and he was knighted. And I was going through his old stuff the other day, and I found his knighthood badge. And on the badge of his knighthood is a white angel standing over a Black devil on the ground. And then even just looking at how, you know, the church, again, has shaped these perceptions. And even looking at, for example, when I was researching Jamaican Junkanoo masquerade songs, there will be songs of that even enslaved women sang about the delicate white rose of the white woman. So even how these perceptions started to assimilate into even our own African-centered masquerade in Jamaica, and the encouragement of their daughters to have children with white men in order to elevate their status in society. Many of these things are shaped by church, by the visuals of angels and the use of language of darkness equating into evil. So one of the things I was going to say, so in order for Black women to elevate themselves in society, in order for them to assimilate and to be respected, they had to diminish many aspects of their appearance, of the way they spoke, in the ways in which that they were, how they navigated in societies. They had to, for example, cover their hair, change the way that they dressed, change the way that they spoke, and all of these things were shaped by the church, which I'll get to in a moment. Also, I wanted to add in the illustration that you see on the left-hand side, illustrations by, it's called Adventures of Johnny Newcomb, and looking at how you would find that white and European people who were in the Caribbean, and how the treatment of Black women, the sexualization of Black women, as you can see the illustrations where they are shaping Black women to look especially unattractive, but these white men are just lusting behind them because they are loose and licentious, and all of these things come back to the church, which I'll get to shortly. In terms of looking at women's bodies and their autonomy, and them having a say over their life choices, and enslaved women, of course, we know, had very little choice. But one thing that I found that was that struck me is I was going through the records, the plantation records in St. Lucia in terms of the punishments or the punishable offenses. And one of the things that I found, as we can see, insolent to the overseer, insolent or disobedient, as we can see in the bottom, it says, keeping a miscarriage a secret. And that spoke volumes to me in terms of how women had to even hide something that is painful, something that is life-threatening, and it is even life-threatening to even have a miscarriage, because often enslaved women were blamed for these things, which I'll get to in a moment. But I felt this was incredibly powerful, especially seeing it in an island as small as St. Lucia. Maybe I'd expect things like that in larger islands like Jamaica, but seeing it from my home country, that there's so many enslaved women that had to keep this a secret, was a big deal to me. And looking at how enslaved women with infanticide. So looking at how enslaved women, the owners of the life was placed almost in its entirety in the hands of Black women, where high rates of child mortality was seen as due to Black women's depravity in the eyes of colonial religious teachings. So in a lot of my studies, because I love dance, I love masquerade, I love our bodily expressions, I love song. So in terms of trying to reconnect how these things play a part in our culture today, I've gone back to look at old writings, and often you'd find the descriptions of Black women as heathenish, as very hypersexualized, and then also they were blamed as being sexually depraved, and this was the reason for the high rates of infant mortality, which of course now we can see that makes absolutely no sense. But it was looking at how the refusal to correlate, for example, not just the backbreaking work and the depleted diets, but just in terms of the lack of having autonomy over their own bodies and how this affected the high infant mortality. Of course, there have also been, in terms of many documentations of Black women being executed or brutally punished on the basis of infanticide. Some of these things could have been discouraged, some of these things were also deliberate. And the lack of consideration as to why these women had to resort to that in terms of rape or sexual abuses, but also the blaming that, for example, in terms of enslaved women and their low rates of marriage, because the church would also manage the validity of a marriage. If a Black woman was not married and she had a child and the child would die, it had to do with her sexual depravity. So these things, again, go back to the church and how their management of society's laws of respectability and what is good and what is evil in a very literal sense. I'm just going to go to the next slide. You'd find, even with the high rates of infant mortality, that enslaved women would tap into their African spirituality in order to support them through their difficult periods. And I think this, I find, considering that all of the laws against African spirituality from very early, even when we look at the slave codes in Barbados, that started from 1630, one of the things was the removal of instruments and the beginnings of the bannings of any African spirituality. So when you look at even 100+ years later, to find enslaved women in places like Guyana, where they use their African spiritual practices to do protective washes and baths for pregnant women and children in order to preserve their life. I find these as great acts of resistance, knowing the severity of the laws that take place and the repercussions if they were caught in doing that. So their pathways of protection, they're willing to take the risk with that. One of the things that we spoke about was marriage and respect. Even today, women are more respected if they're married, right? And if you're not married, it's like, what's wrong with you? And, you know, when we look at, for example, in the island of St. Vincent, no marriages were deemed legal unless they were done by the Anglican Church, even years after emancipation, up until 1841. So several years after emancipation. So the Anglican Church in particular had a monopoly on societal respectability, because marriages don't matter unless we do it. And then also looking at how the increase of religious converts to the Anglican Church, you'd find that Anglican missionaries encourage enslavement to marry with the perception that the domestic duties would be catered to by Black women. So, and again, this is something that still sticks with us today, that we are expected to do everything. And so I think, you know, I found that really important when looking at how the church managed marriages and like completely erase the validity of even people having a say on how or when or who they get married to. You can go to the next slide. Dimming the shine. Oh, this slide has done something funny just now. I'm not sure what's happened here. But one of the documentations that I found was that there was a woman called Mrs. Cowrie in St. Vincent, and she had petitioned for enslaved and free women of color to be paid less, so if they made external earnings, but to be paid less so that they could not afford to buy expensive clothes. Because when you'd find that many enslaved women, they took a lot of pride in their dress in order for them to have a level of autonomy and say over themselves, their own personal appearances. And when they received some money, they took a lot of pride in having a nice dress and looking beautiful. And then even looking at how these things were diminished by the efforts of the society, that Black women must diminish themselves, their appearance, you must be modest, you must be seen, you must not be seen to stand out of the crowd, right? In terms of the laws to cover our hair. And even looking at today, the laws that exist in many of the government offices in the Caribbean, a woman still cannot have her shoulders exposed on entering a government building. This is an old law that was developed by the church and put into our government laws and still exists today. You cannot walk into a government building in a short skirt above your knee, a pair of shorts above your knee, or have your shoulders exposed. Still to this day, okay? We'll go to the next slide. And then also looking at emancipation and financial manipulation. So we're speaking about how the church made us money through owning enslaved people and plantations and their compensation and so on. But looking at even post-emancipation, how they used the finances from formerly enslaved people in order to enrich and expand their empire. And because they could no longer depend on the contributions of the elite. So looking at the newfound freedom that formerly enslaved people had, they were encouraged to join the church. This would give you certain benefits. You'll be seen as respectable. You'll be seen as someone who is employable. You would just see that societal acceptance. And this was especially important for women. And then looking at how the church also disrupted how Black women had their financial independence, because there had been many complaints when I had found looking at some of the records. For example, a letter that was written from Codrington Estate, which ironically was owned by the Anglican Church, making a complaint to the Bishop of London that the Negroes on the Lord's Day merchandise themselves. So looking at how Black women would use the Sunday market as a means to gain their own financial independence, and how the church wanted to stagnate that, and that they must commit themselves to the Lord's Day and go to church. And of course, you must donate to the church as well on the Lord's Day. So looking at all of how it was the forcing of especially Black women to be part of the church in terms of respectability, in terms of your validity as a mother, in terms of even making your financial earnings. The church did have so much of a control over that. And of course, going into looking at African religion as evil and these associations where we're looking at the actual wordings. This is from the Jamaican Obia Act from 1760 in terms of pretending to have communication with the devil and evil spirits. So even looking at the concept of the devil, all of these things would be stemming from Christian faith. I'm gonna go to the next one. One of the things I found really amazing is how women are through African spirituality versus Christianity. So again, looking at some of the research that was done in terms of African spirituality in places like St. Vincent, you could find that a lot of Afro-Caribbean women found more empowerment in African-centered faith practices, as opposed to the Anglican Church, which had the monopoly in islands like St. Vincent. So of course the church, those alternative churches were met with a lot of resistance, but in these churches, these women had the opportunity to become leaders, they had the opportunity to become preachers, they had the opportunity to exercise their own African spiritual healing, as opposed to being within the Christian church where they were relegated to being in a corner, doing big sales, and keeping their voices small and not being in the forefront of religious practice. Okay, so we are near the end because I know I'm pressed for time. Please feel free to interject if I'm going way over, okay? So also looking at poison, paranoia, and the parliament. And as I mentioned, there are many different laws that were put in place from 1760, and again and again and again, they kept being reinstated across across Jamaica to Barbados to St. Lucia to Dominica, and you'd find the correlation behind many rebellions by enslaved people, and then right after they put in this new law to block any forms of African spirituality. When we look at women like Nanny of the Maroons, they said, you know, that she was this evil Obia woman, but she was practicing her Ghanaian African spiritual practices in order to empower her people to resist against colonialism. So even when we look at the correlations between how faith was used to empower, African faith was used to empower, and Christian faith, and of course, in particular, in the British colonies, Anglican faith was used to squash and diminish and to mute the feelings of equality and resistance. So when we look at the, I wanted to touch briefly on the many Afro-Caribbean religions that still exist today in the Caribbean. And many of them still exist today because of Black women. So when we look, for example, at things like the Shakers, Maya, Kumina, Komfa, Obia, these things were built as a merger of African spiritual practices, and some of them have been combined with Christian faith, right? But when we look at, for example, the Shaker sect in St. Vincent, which can also, you can also find the Shouter Baptist in Trinidad, things like that. Women were central to the survival of this sect, especially as the church continued to spread and advocate for everyone to become baptized and converted. The Afro-spiritual practice of Komfa in Guyana is primarily practiced by women. The image that you see here is from Cambridge University, and it is an image of women practicing Komfa in Guyana in the 1950s. And I found existence of Komfa from the 1760s. So, you know, it has survived several centuries, and that's due to women's resistance and holding on as the keepers of the culture. And you'd find a lot of violence resistance to these Afro-Caribbean religions. Of course, everyone thinks today still voodoo is a bad thing, Obia is evil, but looking at how even within places like St. Vincent, the Shaker chapels, some of the Shaker chapels were burned down primarily by persons of the Anglican faith. So I'm going to move on to a couple and about to wrap up. So many of us know about Mami Wata, or everyone's so happy to see the Little Mermaid and so on. But I found an incredible excerpt from Reverend Thomas Banbury, who was an Anglican priest in Jamaica in the late 1800s, and he wrote about the River Moma and the enslaved, sorry, not the late 1890s, sorry, 1830s. And he wrote about the enslaved would go down to encourage the sacrifice of an ox to the River Moma, which is the water goddess. And as you can see in the bottom, as an Anglican priest, he saw that Obia was, as you can see highlighted, wicked, immoral, disgusting, the most filthy of practices, shameful and degrading, and it tends greatly to the pulling down of the Church of Christ. So he was staunchly against any form of African spiritual practice, especially Obia. But then moving on into a book that I found written in Grenada about Obia, it's talking about the same river or water goddess. And I found this something that's so beautiful. And it's speaking about a full moon where there's a procession of Afro-Grenadians heading to Granitang, which is the lake you can see in the middle here. And it says it is, as we can see on your right-hand side, a group of old women dressed up in red cotton frocks with veils of the same material covering their heads, topped with a chaplet at the sum of the green feathery creeping plant which grows in profusion. Then came more elderly females, similarly clad in blue cotton, all dancing frantically to the sound of the most barbarous music which followed them. And basically the story goes on to speak about how they were going on a full moon ritual to honor Mama Glow, which is the River Moma, which is a water goddess, in order for her to grant them favors and so on. But looking at how specifically there were Afro-Grenadian women in the front of this, so they definitely have been collectively over time the gatekeepers and the preservers of these faiths. So very quickly, the same Matthew Lewis who I shown in the previous Jamaica slide. His diary is actually quite interesting because he does speak about Obia. He speaks about Anansi stories, and you can find a lot of the spiritual beliefs in there of enslaved Jamaicans on his plantation. But here he speaks about this young African woman who they were trying for her to be converted into Christianity, into the Anglican Church. And they said it was all in vain because she had strong African prejudices from her mother, and that she found nothing in the Christian system so alluring as, because you're speaking about that her African faith felt more beautiful and more powerful than anything about the Christian faith. And then it goes on to say that the pulpit drum ecclesiastic will find it hard matter to empower the gumby, which he means the drum, and the joys of Christian paradise will be seen as a kick to the beam when they are weighed against the pleasures of somewhat drinking rum. But countries are the jam and kitty catty. So he's talking about African drum, dance, music, and he's saying that there's nothing you can do to convert these people. There's the drum, and of course he's reducing it down to being something frivolous, but I know the power of these things like Jokonu and Carnival and Bele music, and there's so many different versions, and you can see that this young girl was resisting due to the teachings of her mother. Okay, so I'm gonna go 2 more minutes.
Go on, we're running a little bit late. I wanted to try and get some questions in, Fiona, but if you want to just wrap this up, that'd be great.
Yes,
thank you.
I'll very quickly wrap it up in looking at how women shape things like Carnival. Carnival is a very spiritual practice. I am a Carnival ambassador, and I really love to show that Carnival is one of the largest African-based spiritual practices that we have, but it has been diminished into this party of whatever, right? But women were very much the gatekeepers of that, and they resisted through the use of Carnival by taking to the streets, dancing, whining. Even whining in itself is a spiritual practice and is a form of resistance against how the church insisted on diminishing the spirits of Black women. So I would like to take a moment to honor those women who resisted by closing with this excerpt from 1734 is an Anglican priest in the island of Nevis. And he says, a parishioner of his baptized a Black woman and had her well introduced into our religion here in England, but she had not long arrived in Nevis before she poisoned 4 white persons and was executed for doing so. So I would like to honor, in closing, the many women who lost their lives in the resistance, who have been hung for practicing Obia, who have been burnt, who have been accused of infanticide, who have been diminished, and who still pushed on to shine. And this is why we're here today. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That was excellent.